Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. Today it's part 3 of 3, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26. We've already looked at verses 1 through 46 of Matthew chapter 26, and in this lesson we'll conclude the rest of our study. You'll note from the topics that I'm not going to read exactly in the order that Matthew presents. We're going to look at the traitor's kiss, then the arrest in the garden, then we're going to skip around a little bit while we look at the failure of courage, then we'll go back and pick up the rest of the verses by looking at the trial before the Jews and the so-called crime of Christ. Let's get our Bibles out and turn to chapter 26, verses 47 through 50. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. We talked about this earlier in the chapter in a previous video. Did Judas really want Jesus dead, or was Judas trying to force Jesus' hand? If we believe he indeed hated Jesus and wished him dead, this is the most despicable betrayal ever recorded. And that's how most of us think about it. The word used when Judas kissed Jesus meant a fervent kiss from a loved one. Why would Judas kiss Jesus like that? Why did Jesus need to be identified? Those that came to arrest Jesus were from the temple police and perhaps some Roman soldiers attached to the temple. It's incredible that they would not have known who Jesus was. He had just cleansed the temple and performed miracles in their presence. From their point of view, they were looking for a convenient place and a time to arrest Jesus away from the crowds. Perhaps no one was more surprised than Judas when Jesus allowed himself to be arrested. He now disappears from the scene, not appearing again until he is bent on suicide. When he realized what he had really done, he could not cope with his sin. Let's read further ahead. Well, let's go back to verse 50 and read through 56. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then he came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scripture be fulfilled that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me, when day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me? But all this has taken place that the scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled." And then all the disciples left him and fled. Accompanying Judas was a mob, what we would commonly call a lynch mob. Peter does come to the Lord's defense. We see from John 18:10, it was Peter who drew the sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Why did Matthew omit this information? It's hard to say. Perhaps because Matthew was writing his gospel at a time when Peter was still alive and did not want to point the finger at Peter even 35 years after the time that the cutting of the ear happened. But Jesus does make three things crystal clear when he responds. One, there would be no armed resistance on his behalf. Evil will be overcome by weapons of love, not by weapons of evil. In verse 53, we see violence was unnecessary because his arrest was due to his submission to God's will and not the potential lack of firepower. Jesus had purposefully set it up so that there would be a lack of swords. He knew that they had only brought perhaps 1 or 2 swords with them when they left the Last Supper. Violence revealed an ignorance of what was happening, and of course that was according to God's purpose. In other words, because violence took place, we know Peter did not understand what was really happening. The seizure of the Messiah was according to prophecy, as Jesus says. We can confirm 2 things about Jesus from these verses. Number 1, his death was by his own choice. He could have skipped the Passover that year. He could have kept a low profile if he did come to the Passover. He could have slipped away from the mob in the garden. He had done it before. He could have called down God's wrath on his enemies. It's clear that Jesus laid down his life and he died not because men killed him, but because he chose to die for us. Second, he made his choice to die because he knew it was his Father's purpose. He had seen it in the prophets. He knew violence leads to violence. He knew that war would settle nothing. He knew God's purpose could only be worked out by sacrificial love. Time proves him right. 40 years later, the ones who saw to his death would have their city destroyed and their religion crippled. Meanwhile, the man who would not fight is enthroned forever at the right hand of God and in the hearts of men. Leon Morris says it this way: Jesus is demonstrating the behavior of a serene, lordly person doing the will of his God, not the action of some terrified fugitive. Next, we come to a section that begins here in verse 57 and carries all the way through the end of chapter 27, verse 26, the Jewish and Roman trials. Here's a timeline that we will try to follow as we go. First of all, the arraignment before Annas, which you'll have to go read John 18, verses 12 through 14, and also verses 19 through 23. Then the arraignment before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, which we will talk about. The first arraignment before Pilate. The arraignment before Herod, you'll have to go to Luke 23, 7 through 12 to see that. And then we'll be back to talk about the second arraignment before Pilate as we study Matthew's Gospel. You might want to refer back to this chart as you study further into 26 and 27. Let's read. Notice we are going to read out of order here, so be prepared to make the jump in just a moment. So we're going to read 57 and 58. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside he sat with the guards to see the end. Now jump to 69, we'll read to the end of the chapter. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know that man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are too one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and he wept bitterly. We're calling this the failure of courage. These types of stories give the Bible even more credence. Why? Well, mostly because if in man-made religions, They do not let their heroes show their weaknesses. And yet we see Peter's weaknesses, warts and all. Many commentators feel that Mark wrote his gospel while sitting at Peter's feet. Mark's account sheds even more bad light on Peter and his cowardice. You might want to go look at Mark 14, verses 66 through 72. Imagine Peter giving his personal testimony. Could anyone else give a better rendition of how Jesus was willing to forgive? So perhaps Mark's account is actually Peter dictating it to Mark. What happened to Peter could have only happened to a man courageous enough to follow the mob in the first place. And he walked directly into the courtyard of the high priest's house. Let's talk about the denials. The first denial, the maidservant recognizes him. He makes his denial, but he doesn't run away. He does retire to the porch. The second denial, he is recognized again. Now he swears he does not know Jesus, but he still does not make a run for it. Meanwhile, his prominent Galilean accent gives him away. It's the third denial. This time he swears and curses, "I know not the man." But he still intends to stay. Then the rooster crows. Then he leaves the scene and he weeps his heart out. Would we have gone to the courtyard in the first place? Why did Peter go to the courtyard? Well, it's love. Love gave Peter the courage to go there. Love kept him there despite being recognized 3 times. And love made him remember the words of Jesus, and love sent him out into the night to weep. It's that very love that covered Peter's multitude of sins. We'll talk about this in a later video, or perhaps even later in this video. But I want you to think about the comparison between Peter and his denials and Judas and his betrayal, and how each one handled it, and which one actually handled their problem according to God's will. Now, let's go back and read 57 again, and then we'll go 59 through 68. So 57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, He deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is that who struck you? Matthew's account of the trial of Jesus is in 3 phases. The illegal preliminaries convened at the house of the high priest, then the morning meeting of the Sanhedrin, which will take place in chapter 27, verse 1 and 2, and then the appearance before Pilate, which is covered in chapter 27, 11 through 26. Well, who comprised the Jewish Supreme Court known as the Sanhedrin? There were 71 men from among the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the elders, and it was led by the high priest. A quorum of 23 was required for a trial such as this. According to the Mishnah, which was written in the 2nd century, in other words, perhaps 100 years after what happened here took place, according to the Mishnah, criminal cases could only be tried during daylight hours and could not be heard during Passover week. If the verdict was guilty, a full day must pass before the verdict could be confirmed to allow time for the judges to give mercy. No verdict of the court was viable unless it was pronounced at their official meeting place, which was called the Hall of Hewn Stone. At least 2 witnesses must agree and be separately examined with no contact with each other. The accused could present his own witnesses. I want to share with you some more things about this trial that Barclay includes in his commentary from page 353 and 54 of Volume 2. The seriousness of the occasion was impressed upon any witnesses in a case where life was at stake. The witnesses were directed by the presiding judge as follows. Forget not, O witness, that it is one thing to give evidence in a trial for money and another in a trial for life. In a money suit, if thy witness bearing shall do wrong, money may repair that wrong. But in this trial for life, if thou sinnest, the blood of the accused and the blood of his seed unto the end of time shall be imputed unto thee. Still further, in any trial, the process began by the laying before the court of all the evidence for the innocence of the accused, before the evidence for his guilt was adduced. These were the Sanhedrin's own rules, and it is abundantly clear that in their eagerness to get rid of Jesus, they broke their own rules. The Jews had reached such a peak of hatred that any means were justified to put an end to Jesus. So, according to Barclay, the Sanhedrin violated many of its own rules and regulations, and we will put the word possibly in there. However, we have to understand this. The 2nd century rules of the Sanhedrin may not have been in effect during the time of Christ. Remember, the Mishnah was written during the 2nd century. The Sanhedrin could have claimed extenuating circumstances, namely the threat of mob violence. Since they had their minds from the start made up to take the case to Pilate, they would not have jeopardized their chances by breaking any Roman laws. So we know they weren't out to break any Roman laws here. And the apostles never raised the issue of irregularities of the Jewish trial in their later preaching. And in their later preaching, they did accuse the Jews of having Jesus put to death. So it seems that if this trial was not according to Jewish rules and regulations, the apostles might have brought that up. However, by the time the apostles were doing their preaching, they came to realize that Jesus' death on the cross was God's will. We know this. The trial of Jesus was indeed a miscarriage of justice, but we should be careful not to overstate that case to make the point. Let's talk about the crime of Christ, the so-called crime of Christ. The main business of the night court was to formulate charges against Jesus. After examining false witness after false witness, they found 2 who repeated what they said Jesus had said about the temple's destruction. Well, they twisted Jesus' actual words. Remember, Jesus meant the temple of his body would be destroyed, but he would rise up again within 3 days. Jesus refused to reply to these charges, as was his right before the law. But somehow the high priest found out that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Do you claim to be the Son of God? How could Jesus have answered? If he had said no, the trial would have been over. Yes would sign his own death warrant. Jesus adds Daniel 7:13 to his reply. Note that under oath, Jesus confessed the truth, but Peter committed perjury when he put himself under oath out in the courtyard. Cries of blasphemy and rending of garments, perhaps violating Leviticus 21:10, take place among the Sanhedrin. Then they spat on him, they slapped him, and they mocked him. And that's so much for their court of justice and law. A face-to-face meeting with Jesus Christ demands only two responses: to hate him or to love him, to want him dead or want to follow him until death. Neutrality is not an option. When it comes to Jesus Christ, we are either his liegemen or we are his foes. Thank you for studying Matthew chapter 26 with me. This concludes our look at that chapter. Next time we'll begin our study of Matthew 27. Until then, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you have subscribed, thank you very much. Also, when you subscribe, a bell will appear. Please click on that notification bell, and that way you will find out whenever there is a new video posted. Like this video or dislike it. Leave me a comment below. All of those things are greatly appreciated. Share the video with your friends and loved ones. Until the next time we meet, may God bless.